Okay, well, I think we can get started. I think there's another panelist that will be joining us shortly, but maybe having some technical difficulties, but let's kick it off. So today we have Craig and Dan and Elyse from the presentation you guys saw earlier today, and I will be reading off some of the questions that we have prepared that we have gathered from the things you guys have been sending into the chat throughout the day. If during the Q&A you have a new question or follow-up question, please feel free to add it into the chat. But yeah, thanks for joining us here, guys. So there we go. So first question is for Craig. So I know your project is specifically looking at LSD in film, but could you speak a little bit more about other substances representation on the screen, if there is any, and how this has evolved over the years, differently or similarly to LSD?
Right, good question. So when I started this project, I did look at a kind of broad smorgasbord of kind of movies or whatever to try and narrow this down into something more specific. There are like quite a lot of mushroom films out there that I haven't seen all of because there's just too many media to consume when it comes to representations of like psychedelics alone, let alone other substances. But something like Altered States from 1980 has like a Native American, Mexican kind of mushroom ritual sequence in it, which is one of the few, I guess, between the 60s and then you start to see things creep in again in the early 90s. Then there's been like Enter the Void does like a quite interesting DMT sequence, and the whole movie's kind of structured around the Tibetan Book of the Dead. But it does the kind of, in the example I showed from the trip, I guess Enter the Void does that using DMT. We're using like computer technology, so it's a lot more, I don't know, it's a lot more detailed, let's use that term. It also has a nice kind of synesthetic component that I've written about, where there's a telephone rings and you get this kind of visual component to it, which is quite interesting. There's an ayahuasca sequence in a film called Renegade from 2004, I think, which I don't think the movie's particularly amazing, but the stuff that they do with ayahuasca is pretty interesting. It's worth digging out. I can't really speak to the representation of it because I've not researched enough about that particular thing, but there are things out there, let's put it that way. But LSD is just, I'd say mushrooms are probably the next most represented. It's just I don't know how often they aesthetically represent the experience. When you start getting into other drugs beyond that, you get countless examples like alcohol, heroin is like, we've just obviously had Brendan talking a lot about opioids. Well, a lot of like other substance films, and including psychedelics, especially in the 60s, fit within this kind of paradigm of, the problem drug, and especially like addictive substances like heroin fit within that kind of paradigm. But I haven't done a lot of research, but I do think it would be an interesting thing to look at. Actually, someone's just mentioned Worst Person in the World mushroom scene. Another good mushroom scene, it's pretty short, is in a movie called Midsummer. The Ari Aster, it's an Ari Aster movie, right? So that's another good example. There's probably others I just can't think of off the top of my head. But yeah, there's certainly stuff out there. Where I think an interesting research question might be, is there a phenomenological difference between the representations of mushroom sequences, say, and LSD sequences? I'll leave it on that as a kind of open question.
Awesome, thank you. Yeah, next question is for Elyse. Could you expand on what prioritizing socio-historical contextualization of indigenous sovereignty and plant medicine policy would look like? If you have any specific, are there any specific policy reforms that are going on right now, or any movements for policies that specifically would address these indigenous groups?
Yeah, thanks for the question. I was really hoping for the chance to expand on that a little bit. So yeah, there's, a big sort of I guess you could say, conflict right now with regards to peyote, decriminalization. And I guess what I mean by socio-historical contextualization there is really kind of diving in and maybe asking community members like Native American church members and other, indigenous groups about the history of the foundation of the Native American church and the sort of, the historical context around the conditions, the conditions around its founding and why peyote may be a very, it's a cultural keystone species for a lot of Native American tribes. And so they, there's the founding of it, which was centered within, colonization and dispossession and all of that. But then there has also been a very long legal battle that the Native American Church has fought for religious freedom and all of that. And so, and it was a long and very expensive and very fraught sort of battle to get to that point. And so it holds a lot of, very important like relevance to the community. And so I think that if we are able to sort of gather more of those perspectives and some more like information around and stories around that whole history, I think, like from the Native American community members themselves, I think that may yield some alternative perspectives on decriminalization, because it has been voiced by many Native American church members in particular that they do oppose decriminalization. And so maybe with that contextualization coming into play, we can start to have some of these conversations about like what should be prioritized here in terms of policy going forward. And there's a lot that goes into that, and I could it's actually like half of my dissertation research, so I could really spend a long time talking about it, but that's just the tip of the iceberg there.
Nice. Yeah, I'm sure we will continue to dig into this then throughout the Q&A. Dan, Psychlusive seems like an incredible attempt to address a need that has not been met so far. You will be attempting to support those with disabilities via scholarships and support from service providers. What is your strategy for getting clinicians, medical service providers that are doing this psychedelic therapy to support patients with disabilities? How are you hoping to get them on board for this?
Can you repeat that last part as far as the specific clinician part?
Just what is your strategy for getting service providers to support patients with disabilities?
To get specific providers, meaning like, okay, yeah, I believe I know what you mean. I think, first of all, having providers that actually represent all groups, including those with disabilities, is a huge place to start. I included a quote on there from Sound Mind talking about the future of psychedelics and the importance of having various people from various backgrounds represented. That said, as much as I love and respect Sound Mind, they don't have people with disabilities listed on there. So it's like, and I've seen like the Affinity cohort with Fireside and a few other programs, which I'm highly supportive of, exclude people with. So when you include people with disabilities and you include them in the efforts to be facilitators, to have a peer that you can support, then that allows them to be more comfortable to receive the therapy. So, I don't know of any providers right now or any programs that are welcoming non-able-bodied people into the training programs. Like I said, there's efforts for LGBTQ, there's efforts for BIPOC, There, you could argue, it's not a competition or anything, but people with disabilities are suppressed. They have less resources. They have more healthcare costs, and it's harder for them to get re-educated, to get further educated. So some of these to directly answer your question, I think for these training programs to include people living with disabilities to become providers, that way more people would be comfortable to receive the treatment that also have disabilities. And it's just broader representation, broader access, broader equity.
Okay, thank you. Yeah. Yeah, no, it's really interesting to always see this kind of the importance of having these like different perspectives like being voiced and present like in a therapeutic setting, especially having the clinicians you're working with actually having like a background that at least has like bears some similarity to what the patient has dealt with, so they actually can relate to those experiences and the patient can relate to them. And yeah, seeing you bring in this perspective is definitely very different, and I have not seen ever in the space this specific perspective brought up, so it's really valuable.
Thank you for the question, whoever it was. Appreciate it.
Henry, so great talk. That is a very fascinating idea of pi, but do you think it is practically feasible anytime soon? At the pace the psychedelic movement is going, it doesn't seem like many of the different sectors will be able to connect when they traditionally work separately and have very different agendas.
The question is it practical?
I guess the question seems like, yeah, practicality, but feeling like how would these different sectors be brought together when it seems like they have very different goals and motivations?
Yeah, absolutely. I think the bottom line is that's the key. We have to get together, and the exact mechanic by which is unclear. I'll answer the two questions separately because they're related but distinct. Is it practical? Absolutely. We've seen healthcare information exchanges that are orders of magnitude more complex than what we're suggesting here with the psychedelic information exchange. So there is precedent for doing something of this complexity, scope, and scale. Is it hard? Sure. All the stakeholders are pointing in different directions, and baseline course of action is not to create such a thing. And that's exactly the point of what we're talking about in this concept of the PI, the psychedelic information exchange. Prioritizing that, making that a key aspect of success, I argue, or I offer, is critically important to the long-standing success of the commercial rollout of psychedelics. Without having a centralized queryable data set, it's going to be pretty hard to validate that whatever standards of safety, effectiveness, access, and equity any one group may define, without the data to back up that claim, it's going to be really hard to answer whether or not it actually happened. So that's the point. It's very practical, it's very pragmatic, and it's really hard. And key industry leaders need to prioritize that concept to make it happen. There's no doubt about it.
Okay, so I guess you're saying that these different stakeholders will have a it will be in the self-interest of different stakeholders to connect. That it's in the interest of different stakeholders to connect with each other because it'll allow them to ensure that the work they're like doing is more like holistically grounded and actually like being effective in the ways they want it to be effective.
Absolutely. I think once there is a critical mass of data in the psychedelic information exchange, there will be a flywheel effect where everybody realizes it's in their best interest and that it does align stakeholder incentives. I think the hard part is who's going to get the plane off the ground, so to speak, who's going to get it up to speed and start that liftoff. And when we think about patient registries, there are lots of different formats and functions that we can imagine, whether that's funded and driven by an educational institution, by a nonprofit, by a philanthropic investment, there's lots of different it could even be a patient advocacy group that is for or nonprofit, but has a public benefit component. It could be an IP share between commercial entities. There are lots of different, both legal and philosophical orientations that we could take towards the creation of it. And then of course, there's the practical mechanics of integrations, APIs, data privacy, ensuring that the nuts and bolts and the plumbing are perfectly secure and pristine so people can trust this infrastructure. And that's its own heavy lift above and beyond who is in charge of funding it and who's in charge of building it, the mechanics of what exactly we're building. So again, it's not easy, and there are specific steps along the process that we need to solve. And I think the point of my conversation or of my talk was just to underscore that if we don't talk about it, it won't happen. So let's organize the people that are relevant in a multidisciplinary fashion to make sure it does happen.
Okay, thank you.
It looked like we had one person's hand raised. David, do you still have a question you'd like to ask, or was it answered already?
Sure, I will ask it now. Thank you so much, Dan. Congratulations. Looping back around to you. So if someone knew a potential candidate, someone with a disability who had an interest in using or facilitating psychedelics, how can they be put in contact with you and Psychlusive?
Yeah, thank you, David. I appreciate that. We're in the process of the website launch. However, if you wanted to send an email, you can send an email just to Psychlusive, just one word, psychlusive@gmail.com. And we could start from there. Of course, if you want to find me on LinkedIn, you know, we're still to be totally frank with you, I had this idea several months ago, and it was just on a sticky note, and it wasn't through this process to create this talk that really created the vehicle, and the word, you know, came to me. And so it's something that, you know, it's still in its early stages, but I have extensive experience in the nonprofit world, and actually my personal chronic illness journey, the way it's crossed with psychedelics. I know some other highly successful individuals that has a similar path. So like I said, I'm very hopeful for the potential with it, and I'd love to connect with you further.
Awesome. Love to see new opportunities of connection happening right before us. Then Elyse, I have a question from Caleb. So with the westernization of ancient Southern and Eastern shamanic sacraments, attempting to integrate them into the medical model, what is being lost? For instance, the shaman traditionally taking the sacrament themselves to induce a state of hypersensitivity in order to interact with the subtle ranges of the patient's illness to heal.
Yeah, that's a big one for sure. I would say another one is, well, so if we're talking about like the Western medical model in particular, what we're seeing right now, and this may be built out further in the future, but what we're seeing right now is a loss of the community connection. There's a huge like social component to a lot of these traditions, not necessarily all, for instance, ayahuasca traditions are, you know, are always done in a group type ceremony, but peyote, for instance, that is one. And there's, yeah, I would say that's like the big one that comes to mind for me, is, yeah, that sort of social support and then kind of integration into the community afterwards. There's like a whole kind of set of social norms. And that's sort of where I was going with the whole, you know, like cultural, like conscientiously supporting the integration into the cultural context and sort of social sphere of Western society. Yeah, that can kind of be lost with just a purely medical, like sterile clinical model where we have to fit it into one specific box, you know? So that's, yeah, that's something.
Cool, thank you. So another question here for Craig. Intriguing talk, Craig. I'm very interested in the Holy Mountain movie that you mentioned. I took a glance at the trailer and it seems like a very bizarre movie. You mentioned the director intended for the audience to be high when watching the movie. Do you think this movie or others like it would be enjoyable or accessible to a sober audience? Or does one necessarily need to be in an altered state of mind to get the meaning out of such a unique film?
Okay, so Hodorowski is like a very unique artist. He brought a lot of his he was involved in this theater movement called Panic. I think it was Panic, and they were like heavily influenced by this guy called Antonin Artaud, and he came up with this idea of theater of cruelty. So a lot of his philosophy, that their idea was you'd go out and kind of provoke the audience. It wasn't about like, we're acting, we're pretending to be real people on the stage, and it was all kind of, his filmmaking kind of comes out of that. You can certainly enjoy the movie without taking any kind of psychedelic or any other substance. It's like an intertextual kind of mosaic of all of the ideas that you'd ever consumed. So there's lots of tarot references in that movie, lots of stuff that references to philosophers and philosophy. I think it's probably more interesting in some ways to engage with it in a sense of, you can look at it as a psychedelic trip in a sense, the way the film unfolds. You've got to kind of think of it as not literal. You watch it almost like it's a series of metaphors. I think the question about whether it would be more enjoyable watching it while you took, I don't know, whatever dose of whichever psychedelic, or even if you smoke some weed or something, is an interesting question. It's kind of where I try to finish my talk off was, there's this, I guess there's an opportunity as we reach a state of like legalization perhaps, or certainly more sort of, I don't know, better drug laws, let's put it that way, where we could actually find out whether, not that it was more or less pleasurable to watch a movie like that, but if a director intended it to be watched like that, how do audiences feel when they do watch it? At the moment, it's very difficult to do research like that. And I do think there is room for psychedelic research in a kind of recreational and cultural sector. I know somebody's doing some research in anthropology, looking at like recreational users at festivals. Why not in the movie theater? Why not in the home, watching with friends? I think there's a great opportunity there. It's something I'd be interested in conducting that kind of research interdisciplinary, because I don't have the experience administering and I would not be comfortable doing that. But in the right circumstance, that I think there's a lot to learn about how do we understand films? That is an open question, and one that I think pharmacologically altered states can certainly help us answer. I think that answers your question, I hope. It was a great question. Thank you very much.
Yeah, no, thank you. That was a great answer. Okay. Elyse, I have another question here for you. Why do you think psychedelics, or how do you think psychedelics could challenge culture and Western hegemony? What in psychedelic use just exists within the cultural milieu rather than inherently oppose it or challenge it? For example, the hippies of the 60s, were they a result of psychedelics or a result of massive societal upheaval during the civil rights movement, public assassinations, and the first color broadcast war?
These are great ponderings. Yeah, I think maybe a little bit of both. Definitely no drug use exists in a vacuum, and it's all within a cultural context. And so I think, yeah, definitely, if you've ever seen John Ehrlichman's statement, so the very close Nixon aide, he stated, about how the real purpose of the war on, well, not the war on drugs, but the Controlled Substances Act was to sort of, if we could vilify like the hippies and everything, we can stop the opposition to the war and everything, and then obviously all the other drugs as well. And yeah, but I'm trying to think about the best way to answer this, because yeah, there are a lot of like interacting factors that come into play here. I think there were other variables that influenced sort of the hippie movement in addition to psychedelics. It sort of came into play with like the beat movement and everything, and that sort of, yeah, there's a convergence of different factors. I may not be fully answering your question here, but like.
No, I think, no, I see what you're saying. Yeah, I think, do you know if there's any researchers, writers that are, I think, like, I guess trying to tackle like the, like, not what the modern hippie looks like, because I feel like hippie's a historical term at this point. It is a function of its very specific context, but anyone just trying to like study what the modern hippie, quote unquote, would look like now that we have internet and we have corporatization is not what it was in the 60s. War is not exactly what it was in the 60s. The issues we're dealing with are a little bit different, like, and in seeing like what this modern hippie looks like.
So the question is like, are there any researchers sort of looking at this kind of, at like the modern
cultural influence? Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, there are definitely some, well, so Nicholas Langlitz, like just in terms of anthropologists, he's one that's actually, I mean, he's looking also at like the psychedelic researchers themselves, but of course, those are, the researchers are part of the movement themselves, and a lot of them, especially the older generation, may have been former hippies. So yeah, I mean, there's some, and then I know, let's see, should I like start name dropping here? I'm not sure. There are several other anthropologists doing some of this work. I'm starting to dive into it a little bit as well for the other half of my research, that like I'm going to be exploring these contexts in Oregon, the sort of the psychedelic communities there, specifically in Portland. But yeah, there are some that are definitely looking at some of these issues. So yeah.
No, I mean, yeah, if you want to drop some names in the chat while I ask this next question, I'm sure some people would definitely appreciate that and want to look more into it.
Sorry if I just thought I would chime in with something on that subject about like kind of the emergence of psychedelic use in certain contexts. I think it is quite interesting. Has anyone read Ido Hardigan's American Trip? That kind of touches on it. So he talks about how psychedelics, at least since the 50s in the US, obviously judging by its title, kind of could only have manifested in the way they did at the time they did. So I think part of the original question was about whether the hippies led to the psychedelic movement or the other way around, or how they kind of related to one another. His book kind of explores that. He kind of says the explosion of kind of psychedelics in the counterculture could only have happened in the 60s because they arrive at the same time, if that makes sense. It's kind of a chicken egg type situation. Anyway, sorry, I just thought I'd chime in with, because it's a great book as well, Ido's books, well worth a read. I think I'm pronouncing his first name correctly.
No, yeah, thanks for that book, Greg. I have been meaning to read that myself. Yeah, I think it's really interesting, especially when we talk about if are we going to repeat the 60s or something? And it feels like it's inherently impossible. Like we can never have the same cultural emergence happen again, because it's not the same exact culture. But yeah, no, thanks for that recommendation.
And I'll also, just real quick, I wanted to add that, yeah, it definitely will not be the exact same, especially because we do see, I don't know if anyone's, up on the investigative journalism of symposia, but they report a lot on the sort of right-wing aspect of psychedelia and how there's a lot of kind of, different directions that the community is going in terms of, political perspectives, and then like kind of corporate dealia, like there's a lot of different, factors that are kind of changing things a little bit from what we recognize it as the hippie movement,
Yeah, awesome, guys, thank you. Another question for Henry. Similar to the previous question that we asked, how do you envision whether different sectors will be included in the PI model or not? We've heard that about very different diverse substances during the conference, from traditional psychedelics like LSD and psilocybin to more controversial substances like PCP and nitrous oxide that some may not even consider to be psychedelics. Do you think there should be any sort of inclusion-exclusion criteria for whether a certain sector should be included in your model?
Yeah, that's a great question. I would start first and foremost with psilocybin and the adult use model in Oregon, as well as MDMA and the clinical trial work with MAPS. I think it's an open question if ketamine should be included as it's already legal. My baseline consideration is legal is the key. So start there and only work with above board um, practitioners that are doing this under licensure within the appropriate protocols of whatever the legality looks like in local jurisdictions, and take it from there. It can be rather expansive, and it's fun to think about the full scope, especially as it relates to safety and effectiveness, access and equity, and how that impacts truly everybody at every corner of the both supply chain and delivery protocol, as well as patients and participants and everyone downstream of them. So I think there are a lot of different stakeholders, a lot of different pieces we could include, a lot of different compounds and therapeutic protocols we could include. And I think of it as starting at the core and working our way out. Start with one thing, do that one thing well, or two things and do it well. And that will be pretty cross applicable to other contexts, other compounds, other protocols, and learn and adapt along the way. There's no way we can have the answer for 3 years from now today. So approach it with a curious mind and an open heart. Start with something, do something well and productive, make it have specific use cases and protocols that it answers for, have a reporting mechanism, and take it from there. I'll round that out, Victor. I think it's about the feedback loops. If I really zoom out, it's about creating tighter learning and feedback loops so that we can accelerate the understanding of how to make these compounds safe and effective for everyone that could benefit from them. And from that perspective, it's more agnostic to the compound or the protocol or the practitioner's model, and more focused on how do we shorten the learning cycle, create those feedback loops in a thoughtful, coherent manner, and build the systems around the delivery protocols so that we can ensure we're getting better every step of the way.
Awesome. Yeah, no, thank you so much for that answer. Yeah, I think emphasizing the feedback loops definitely I think that's like the most salient like takeaway I think like from the talk is that. So yeah, no, thank you. All right, Dan, I have another question for you. So I'm curious about specific substances that chronic pain patients might find helpful. You mentioned ayahuasca helped you to change your outlook on what healing could be. Is this the primary substance you find helpful in your healing journey, or do you use other modalities as well? And in what way do you find psychedelics help? It's a lot of questions actually I'm realizing embedded within this one. So we'll stop with that one. So what substances do you think would be specifically helpful for chronic pain patients relative to other ones? And which ones have you personally found be most helpful?
Yeah, and the very first part, I'm with you on those. What was the very first part of the question before that?
What specific substances would chronic pain patients find helpful?
Okay, yeah, thank you. Yeah, I mean, I think it would be arrogant of me to tell others in a way. I think it's subjective is what I'm getting at. Healing is subjective. The way one interacts with certain medicines is unique. That said, yeah, from an I statement, if you caught some of my talk, I was undiagnosed for several years. I was told that my illness was all in my head. My providers tried to put me on various pain medications and pain reducing SSRIs, but I knew that not that those medications are bad inherently or wrong, but I knew that if I treated my symptoms, then I would only make it muddier to not understand fully what was going on at the root cause. So that's really the power of these medicines, is not to say you take, psilocybin or drink ayahuasca or something and the medicine's going to come and tell you why you're ill. I'm not saying that necessarily, but there's many layers. If you saw the slide from my presentation about the iceberg, that was talking about the many invisible layers of mainly the emotional burden and things of that nature. But within the actual physical illness themselves, itself, you could have similar icebergs. So what I've found is, yes, I do think this may be an unpopular opinion, but with many autoimmune conditions and a lot of different conditions, the Western model does not dig into what the root cause of a lot of these illnesses are. And at the same time, a lot of people that end up in full-on disability, applying for disability and things of that nature, often do have severe physiological illnesses going on in their physical body, but it's also the other factors in their life. So now their personal relationships are crumbling. Now their marriage is falling apart. Now they can't work. Now all of that, like, we're all connected. Not to sound, you want to talk about hippie stuff, we can talk about it. It's not just, oh, because in the Lyme community, which I was deeply ingrained in for many years, a lot of talked about is killing the bugs. It's just attacking the bugs that are in your body, bomb it with whatever it is. If it's herbs, if it's antibiotics, kill the bugs and you'll feel better. But that's not really how, the most effective way, in my opinion. You can't blow everything up in order to, to heal. So the grander point being, these medicines help you kind of go through the layers of the guilt, the shame, the survival mode, the PTSD of, oh, I was healthy, and constantly comparing yourself, that people not being able to connect to you, not being believed by providers, that in itself leads to PTSD within the medical system, which I've dealt with. I didn't even get into my talk as far as, if anyone knows anything about Lyme disease, how, the Western model doesn't even acknowledge it a lot of times for late stage. But going back to the original question of, yes, I believe psilocybin is a very powerful plant that can help people with chronic illness. Ayahuasca, yes, I do believe. I mean, the other quick point is that, unfortunately, these are still federally banned substances. So, just put that disclaimer out there, and, part of my fear, and honestly, this is the first time, and that's why I said it in my talk, that it's coming out of the psychedelic closet, because I haven't publicly talked online. I think we have enough New York Times articles and everyone saying chronic pain, the solution to chronic pain, psilocybin. And I don't think that is the answer either. These plants, I'll just lastly say, these plants are powerful allies. Some would call them tools, we can get into the mud there, but it's a powerful ally that can help you really awaken your inner healer. MAPS talks about it, in their manual. But we are, I believe, our own biggest healer. And yes, that's why just lastly I talked about in my presentation, you have the actual mechanisms, the scientific mechanisms, which is important to understand that these medicines do work on a scientific level to adjust that. But it's also your perception to pain, it's your perception to the whole illness, it's working through all the trauma layers that come with the illness or may have led to the illness. So lastly, I'll just say, no matter the substance, whether it's psilocybin, ayahuasca, I've worked with toad. I'm a combo practitioner, which is a non-psychoactive, very powerful medicine for autoimmune conditions. There's many different medicines out there, whatever intuitively feels best, finding a safe provider, but then also integrating, doing the work. That's why I brought up talk therapy. I was in talk therapy for years and years before I even touched a plant. And then when you use these plants, you have to have support. You have to be able to integrate and work through it. It's not just, that's the danger of these headlines. Lastly, I'll say, is just like, oh, does psilocybin cure depression? Does psilocybin, help chronic pain? It's not just that's the medical model. Take a pill and all of a sudden, no, that's not the way integrative, holistic well-being comes from. So just as long as we preface that when we're talking about these powerful plant allies, then yeah, we can talk about it.
Yeah, no, thank you for that answer. And what you're saying at the end, it reminds me of one of the keynotes Haley Duran was saying about psychedelics as a bicycle. You're still doing the work, it's just a really good, it's a great tool, and it'll take you somewhere awesome, but you got to pedal the bike. So yeah, no, it's really cool. I'm bouncing off of that. Have you heard, like, has anyone through reckless, like perhaps trying to just take it as a pill and a quick, easy fix, or maybe certain like a compound just didn't agree with them very well, even though they were trying to go into it with intentionality? Has anyone ever, at least even in the short term, exacerbated their chronic pain in trying to treat it with psychedelics?
I can't say I've ever had, someone else might be able to speak to the, say a psilocybin facilitator, or someone might be able to speak to it. Just quickly, I'll say in the context from my personal journey within the Lyme community, some people may or may not be familiar that there's a phenomenon they call the herx. Apologize if there's a motorcycle going by, but anyway, the gist of it is by treating, it's called a Herxheimer, by treating a pathogen that you're dealing with in your body, it exacerbates your symptoms in the short term, because there's a die-off period when you're treating against the pathogen. Now, I have never heard of that as far as these medicines. I don't think that would be the case, because you're not targeting any specific pathogen. You're literally not integrating, but you're manipulating, maybe not be the right word, but you're stimulating, maybe the right word, the 5-2A, So, and I didn't include this in my talk because I couldn't find the appropriate resources, but I had heard a theory that, as these medicines work in 5-2A, yes, they change your perception to the pain and all of that, but they alter two different gene sets. One of the gene set is a physiological inflammation gene set that it down regulates. I don't know that to be true. I would be very interested. I think part of it, I didn't really overly emphasize in my talk, is that it's way understudied. I think somebody actually in my talk group had mentioned how there, now, for those who may not know, there's an explosion in psychedelic science that has happened in the last several years with the current psychedelic renaissance of, the majority of those are PTSD, depression, anxiety. Only 5% of all clinical trials right now is alcoholism. And I think chronic pain might be 1% or something like that. There's like really very, very, very understudied. So, I'd like to see more studies, but to answer your question directly, no, I've never heard of that phenomenon. But lastly, I'll conclude it by saying, I personally, 4 years ago, when I first started sitting with medicine, was afraid to sit with medicine because I didn't know how it would integrate within a chronically ill, sick body. And I remember talking to the facilitator up front, being like, hey, blah, blah, blah. And they kind of look at you like, why would, and here's the whole thing with, not understanding stigma and all that. And he was just like, no, you'll be okay. But he had no idea of anything as far as disability goes. It's like that's where it's interesting when you meet kind of shamanism. That's where I think we have some promise, within integrating some of this Western model, although it's mainly like within like psychologists and things like that. But I would like to see, someone, maybe that could be open with an integrative physician and say, hey, I'm looking to go work with a psilocybin facilitator in Oregon. Here's my physiological, the things that are with my disability. Do you think that it's appropriate for me to pursue this treatment? Having that the care overlap, because that's the big problem with the Western model, is it's very compartmentalized. You go and talk to your specialist and they may or may not, blah, blah, blah. And a lot of times, even like to get your PCP, how often do PCPs talk to therapists? Unless it's a psychiatrist, but even then it's just on, medication based. It's not on, oh, do you think because it does get murky in a sense, because, you talk about disability, there's physical disability, of course, there's mental disability as well, but then, there's a lot of talk and a lot of nonprofits and different organizations that are bringing veterans down to Mexico to work with Iboga and Toad and all kinds of stuff. How do you, I don't know who can say, but how is, somebody in a stable place to go and use these medicines? Because lastly, I'll say these medicines are amplifiers, non-specific amplifiers. So they're going to amplify different things that you're dealing with, which can be extremely intense. So if you're dealing with, as far as disability goes, extreme isolation, depression, all of the things that I talked about in my talk, guess what? Ceremony might not be a cakewalk for you. I mean, my experiences with ceremony have been very, very difficult experiences for the most part. I mean, a lot of people think, oh, just take these medicines and, you know, heal my trauma and I'll cure my illness. You better dig in, you know, like, I'm not trying to say it like that, but I mean, if you're dealing with some difficult things, they may be amplified, and the amplifying part might not be that, I don't think it's that your pain's going to be amplified. It may be, you know, your childhood pain that you didn't know that you had underneath. It may be, you know, how you neglected yourself and let this pattern continue of your needs not being met. And then 10 years later, when you were in a full blown episode within chronic pain or it comes to you in ceremony. Hey, remember when you put everyone before yourself? Like, and you're like, oh man, I don't want to look at this. This is very painful. You know, that's more of the things that I would be concerned about rather than exacerbating a physical pain.
Yeah, no, that's a great answer, and a nice cautionary tale at the end there as well. Yeah. I also shared there's a great review paper that I really enjoy that's like about it's more like pharmacological like focus, but just it's like a good review of like all these studies with LSD and psilocybin. I think mostly on chronic pain, interestingly even phantom limb pain. These are like some of these are very old, like 1960 studies, but it's fascinating stuff. It's fascinating that we were like starting to dig into this and then it just shut down, and now we're getting back there. So it's very exciting to see what's going to be out there on the horizon. Yeah, we're just barely touching the surface of so many different potential uses of these compounds. But yeah, thank you. Next question is for Elyse. So Elyse, I really liked your presentation. I am a supporter of decriminalized nature. Wondering what your thoughts are on this, as various states in the US change the legal status of psychedelics. If a medical model is implemented, should a decriminalized model be required to safeguard those who do not want to use / have access to that medical system?
Yeah, that is something I agree with. So like I've been a very big supporter of decriminalized nature for a while now. I take no issue with that at all. I definitely think that decriminalization is something that we need to aim for, and I think it'll be a very important safeguard for the non-clinical users, the people that either can't afford or choose not to pursue the clinical route. I think I still hold, for now at least, that peyote should maybe requires a little bit more careful consideration and some time to think that piece out. But of course, peyote isn't, and even mescaline, even while there are some investigations into it now, peyote is not like something that's being super commercialized or anything by the incoming pharmaceutical industry or anything. So yeah, I do think that we should decriminalize for sure. We should decriminalize these, psilocybin and LSD and ketamine. I mean, I think that it should be fully decriminalized, fully like descheduled, as opposed to just, shifting things around in the regulatory, the schedule 1 through 5. Like, yeah, I think it all should be decriminalized, because otherwise we're just going to be perpetuating the same issues. So, and access is a huge obstacle that we're going to need to overcome. So yeah.
Nice. Yeah, I feel like a few of the things being discussed now, and even just with the keynote that we had right before this, it makes me think of this. There's this article that we were trying to submit as IPN, a few of the leadership team writing together this idea of psychedelics for all, a free federally distributed drug supply. That way there's like none of this access is guaranteed. Basically, if you want a compound, you have a compound. The marketing incentives of this predatory like marketing and advertising, pushing this onto doctors, encouraging them to then give to prescribe this to patients. And so, yeah, I don't know. It just feels like there's a lot of ways moving forward that we can really try to guarantee this this acts as decriminalizing, from decriminalizing to legalizing to a federal supply of drugs for anyone who wants them. And it's I'm very excited to see how we end up dealing with this across the United States, because I think decriminalized nature is just the first really effective movement to come about. But I would bet there's going to be a lot of permutations of that movement across different states in these coming years. So excited to see what that looks like.
Yeah, and I'll just add also that you know, decriminalization doesn't fully eradicate the black market, of course, because where there is an ability to sell, it's going to be sold. There's going to be a profit somewhere, and so yeah, I've thought that for a while now, I've thought that our like regulatory agencies and policymakers, and you know, we need to think a little bit more creatively, I guess, with regards to how we're going to, you know, deal with drugs in a sensible, public health oriented manner. And so I have, when we were in the keynote just before this, I was thinking about how there have been other instances in which, for instance, alcohol in Russia in the 90s, it was like the mid 80s through the 90s, there were some major shifts in, you know, how alcohol was regulated, and essentially there was a federal monopoly over alcohol because there was, you know, they implemented a federal monopoly over it because there were so many. It was like this epidemic of you know, death and like you know, just all kinds of alcohol related diseases and things. And so once they implemented that monopoly, it like, I mean, the negative impacts just were cut like in half. It was a really, really great move on their part. And then they saw with the more, with the sort of, I guess you could say neoliberalization a little bit of some of the policies in Russia, then we saw the alcohol problems come back again. And so while a monopoly never sounds great, and that's never been something that I've been a fan of, especially if we think of like big cannabis, that kind of thing, and how things are consolidating and the companies, you know, it can cause a lot of problems. But I think that if, I think a federal monopoly may be a viable option, as long as the profit incentive is maybe held under control a little bit, because where there is sort of an assumption of like infinite growth potential, that's oftentimes where we see a lot of the problems begin with regards to profit making and all of that. So and that actually we do have federal, like either federal or state, well, yeah, we have state monopolies over alcohol in some places in the US actually, and it does help, but we've seen increasingly over the years that there can be, sorry, I'm not able to read that yet, but yeah, essentially if the state has a monopoly over the supply, sometimes it can still implement a lot of advertising and kind of, you know, marketing to the moon. Like it can still do the same thing and just have control over it and just be the ones to decide like all of this advertising. So it just, there needs to be controls built into the system, whichever way we do it. But I do think that there should be some sort of regulatory framework and maybe a federal supply that is like legal, but in the meantime, maybe decriminalized until we can figure out how to not put profits over people. So,
awesome, thank you. And now for our last question, Craig, now that psychedelics are becoming more mainstream, do you see any trends emerging in film or TV that reflect this slow process of destigmatization? For example, do you see more representation or distinct representations now than say 10 or 20 years ago? Or is film and TV industry not quite there yet?
I think there's something kind of interesting to talk about in regard to kind of the things that Lisa's been talking about. I guess we've got such a different model of distribution of film and TV, which is not my area of expertise, but certainly the way shows are made, distributed, what's funding them, has an effect on how and what we can portray in screen media. So towards the end of the 60s, you got a slew of kind of LSD movies because there was a restriction lifted in the US and you could start a show. I'm not like an expert in either, but there was like I can't remember the framework that was used, the names of it, but there was a change and suddenly you could represent drug experiences. And I guess people were less interested for a while when the counterculture kind of died down. And I think now you see what you see. One of the things I was interested in when I started the project is, are people showing them in a more favorable light? Because we're going through this kind of psychedelic renaissance. Was there this kind of sort of feedback loop? We've heard that term today. Was it like, oh, now I can put psychedelics on screen and show them to be these great positive progenitors of like, I don't know, health or whatever? And actually, I would say that isn't the case. I think they just appear in a whole variety of contexts. They can be shown as, they appear in horror films, or like Mandy is kind of a horror movie, which has an LSD theme to it. They can appear in stuff where it's kind of vaguely comical. They can appear in things where they are kind of trying to look at that kind of therapeutic context. And quite often when they do that, they look back to the 60s and reintroduce the kind of models from the 60s. A good example would be the Mad Men one that I showed. That kind of very much fits the 60s vibe. It's set in the 60s. It's not the only one. So I don't know. I think as we're getting more decentralized in terms of the way we make media and the way we distribute media and who's making it and how they're distributing it, we're getting actually probably a proliferation of more interesting and diverse portrayals of drug states, which I think is actually a good thing because of the things that people have said throughout the course of these 3 days, which is they aren't miracle drugs, they're not miracle cures, and people do use them in different contexts and will continue to do so. You know, like psychedelic drug use spiked after they were prohibited. The use proliferated into the 70s, and people just found ways of doing it. It was just the media wasn't interested anymore. I guess the question is, now that the media is interested, is there going to be any kind of backlash? I guess that's the open question that I would leave that question with. And thank you for the question.
All right, well, guys, thank you so much for taking the time to participate in the live Q&A. Thank you to everyone who sent in these questions throughout today's presentations. This was really fun to be able to ask these and have the audience engage so intentionally and powerfully with all our speakers. So thank you again. So just a quick clap for that. And we're about to start our closing ceremonies. Hey everyone, so we have reached the final stage of the second annual PsychedelX conference. We are now going to begin the closing remarks. Over these past 3 days, we've had the opportunity to hear incredible stories, perspectives, and ideas from rising scholars and leaders across the ecosystem. We hope the PsychedelX experience will inspire students to stride with confidence in their next professional steps, whether that be publishing a paper on their topic, applying to or completing graduate school, or simply sharing their story on broader platforms. Fundamentally, we believe that with a bit of encouragement and feedback, that students can more readily convey their perspectives and ideas in ways that will help make the world a better place. We anticipate that the talks shared and the connections made at PsychedelX will reverberate in the psychedelic ecosystem for years to come. Moreover, we've had over 300 individuals register to this year's conference, and it is an honor to publicly be able to uplift and share all of these voices. We turn to rising figures, scholars, and students in the psychedelic ecosystem for their wisdom, their unconstrained vision, and passion for what the future of the field and society at large can look like. So to our speakers, I want to conclude by saying that the future belongs to those who believe in the beauty of their dreams. So keep dreaming and keep working very hard. For those of you tuning in, if you have found this experience to be personally valuable or appreciate the significance of psychedelics in the ecosystem and initiatives like this, then please consider visiting our website, joining the network as a member, or donating to the Intercollegiate Psychedelics Network. Before we announce our winners, I also just want to go ahead and say thank you to all the people who helped put this event together across all the different groups within IPN. So the core psychedelics team, I want to thank Alex Seeloff, Aylin Alstrand, Aaron Nahard, Rose Timazir, Isla Weber, Tinya Chang, Alex Piot, Ivan Filipov, Waldo Guzman, Jeremy Scott, Victor Acero, who were in charge of developing the psychedelics conference and programming. And then from our community mushroom, Tate Ankerbrecht, Peter Maloney, Keegan Stryker, who supported psychedelics in developing community events and helping bring all our participants together to build those meaningful connections that we really cherish. And finally, Emily Kribas, Uma Chatterjee, and Luke Johnson, who supported psychedelics as members of the media mushroom and developed all the graphics and beautiful things that we have been looking at throughout this entire event and all the advertising materials that hopefully brought you here. And lastly, our talk creation coaches, who literally we could have not developed these talks without, including 2 former psychedelics participants from last year, and Maria Balliet, Connor Flanagan, Carly Domenico, Joel Lopez, Emily Kribas, Aylin Alstrand, Aaron Nahart, and me again, Victor Acero. And of course, we also want to thank our judges who have reviewed our finalist talks and helped us decide on our final winners. So Dr. Manoj Das, a postdoctoral researcher and fellow at the Johns Hopkins University Center for Psychedelic and Consciousness Research, as well as an IPN advisor. Ivan Esqueda Romano, a doctoral researcher at the University College London's Institute for Cognitive Neuroscience and the director and co-founder of the Drugs and Me Hub. Dr. Kiran Ahmad, the clinical research fellow in psychopharmacology at Imperial College London, running clinical studies. Dr. Martha Newson, an anthropologist by training, she uses evolutionary frameworks to study human behavior and has even studied the ritual of raves. And finally, Dr. David Luke, an associate professor of psychology at the University of Greenwich and founder and director of Breaking Convention. And so, without further ado, the most effective, novel, impactful presentations from PsychedelX 2022. Our runner-ups are Gerardo Gonzalo, on the potential of ayahuasca-assisted meditation to improve social cognition. Aileen Kuxera on Are Clinicians Ready for Psychedelics? Henry Finkelstein on Growing the Pie in Commercial Psychedelics, Technology plus Data Solutions to Support the Safety and Effectiveness, Access, and Equity. Thank you guys. These are our runner-ups. Incredible jobs with your presentations. The work that you put into your presentation showed very clearly, and the ingenuity was palpable. And now, drum roll please for our top 3 presentations. In 3rd place from the natural science category, Zarmeen Zahid, examining hippocampal prefrontal synaptic plasticity in the neural mechanisms of serotonergic psychedelic action. In 2nd place from the psychology and clinical applications category, Kayla Greenstein on the ethical considerations on boundaries and the use of touch in psychedelic and MDMA assisted therapy. And finally, in 1st place, and also from the natural science category, Uma R. Chatterjee on MDMA and OCD, exploring the effects of MDMA-assisted therapy for PTSD and comorbid OCD. So everybody, please put your hands together virtually for our winners of this year's Psychedelics.